Welcome everyone to the first international conference of Family Economy Week. The Family Economy Week is the event to promote economic and financial education for citizens on the topics of saving, investments, protection, pensions, and asset management, all with the patronage of the European Commission and the European Parliament. Also this year, there are many countries that have joined this event, and our goal is to create more and more awareness on the issues of personal economy and on the culture of the economy that embraces, as you know, much longer times than savings and investments in general form. And it's also for this reason that on an international level, we have decided to highlight an extremely important issue, the social issue. And the title of this conference is Social Inequalities Create Economic Inequalities, from the gender gap to youth employment to the wage gap, how to overcome them. And we will talk about it with some special guests that I would like to present to you immediately. Welcome, first of all, to Philip Borzi, former Obama administration's Assistant Secretary for Employee Benefits and Security of the United States Department of Labor. Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome to the Family Economy Week. And welcome also to Felicia Henderson, Adjunct Lecturer at the Sciences Paul Paris.
Thank you.
Welcome also for you, Felicia Anderson, and welcome to Eleftherios Nicolaou, Managing Director of Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute.
Thank you for having us. I would like to say that we're extremely delighted to be part of this year's Family Economy Week, which is actually our third year in a row. All of us at the Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute wholeheartedly believe that this initiative has and is going to have a strong impact both in the European community as well as internationally through the highly esteemed participating organizations.
Thank you, Eleftherios, for your presentation. And nice time to you, Phyllis Borzi, for the introduction on the topic of today's conference, and in particular on the social inequalities that have arisen in the post-COVID. So it's time for your speech, Phyllis Borzi. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad to be with you today. In the past few decades, I guess, policymakers and employers in the United States have begun to focus on the need for greater financial education to help workers and individuals better understand their financial needs, set goals to be sure they have adequate retirement income, and understand what steps to take to meet these goals. This is especially important since the trend in the US, like that globally, is for employers who provide a critical and significant source of retirement income in the US to move away from traditional pension plans, defined benefit plans, and substitute individual savings arrangements such as 401k plans, where the investment and longevity risks are fully borne by the individual. But as policymakers and employers spend more time focusing on the need for financial education, they really can't overlook the key structural weaknesses in the US system that makes the challenge to be sure that individuals don't outlast their savings much more difficult to overcome, especially for women. In recent years, women in the United States have made slow but steady progress in achieving economic security both for themselves and for their families. Yet many challenges remain, and those challenges have been exacerbated by the widespread and continuing effects of COVID-19 on the workforce. Today, I'm going to talk briefly about some of those challenges for women, both in the paid workforce and in retirement, focusing primarily on the wage gap, the retirement savings gap, and changes in women's employment patterns due to COVID and the future of work and what that means for the economic security of our families in the United States. First, the wage gap. Today, the number of women in the workforce is much greater than ever before. In fact, in 2020, for the first time, the number of women workers exceeded that of men, with women constituting 51% of the total individuals in the workforce. But that number is somewhat misleading because a greater number of women workers continue to be clustered in the part-time, low-paid service sector of our economy. In fact, the median income for women is nearly $15,000 less than men, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Moreover, when you compare the wages of men and women working at the very same full-time jobs, women make only 82 cents for every dollar that men earn. The problem is even worse for women and minorities. Black women make 61 cents on the dollar. Latinas make 53 cents on the dollar. In addition to this pay gap, working women face other obstacles that further reduce their ability to earn as much as their male counterparts. Most significantly, women continue to serve as their family's primary caregivers for children, for spouses, older relatives, thus causing them to reduce their working hours or drop out of the workforce entirely, either on a temporary or permanent basis. As I said a minute ago, women are more likely to work part-time or in industries with lower wages or in jobs where there's no fixed hours or pay, such as housekeepers or personal care workers. These challenges faced by women have a spillover effect on their retirement security, because in most instances, retirement income is tied to work. In the United States, our Social Security system is not designed to provide a sufficient monthly income for all Americans to live in retirement. Although, sadly, approximately 30% of older women have no other source of retirement income. That means they don't have any income from employment-based pension plans or personal savings. And of course, the older the woman, the more likely she will be to have to rely totally on her Social Security benefit in retirement. And Social Security credits are also based on work and income criteria. Since traditional employer-sponsored pensions are based on these same criteria, interruptions in continuous employment and the pay gap put many women at a disadvantage in earning pension income. And the shift to defined contribution individual savings arrangements not only shifts the burden of investment performance to the individuals, but also means that these lower paid women are less able to contribute to their savings program on a regular basis. Moreover, the irregular work patterns that many women face make them less likely to accumulate sufficient retirement income, since U.S. pension law often penalizes workers who leave the workforce for a period of time and then return to work. Sadly, the United States is nearly alone in the global world in its failure to provide for paid family and medical leave. Although our law does require employers with 50 or more employees and certain other employers to provide 12 weeks of unpaid leave with job protection. But unpaid leave generates no employment credit for retirement plan purposes. So what happens when a woman takes on the role of caregiver? How does that impact her retirement? While a quarter of the women, the older women, are currently providing care, many more have been involved in providing care over the course of their lives. Nearly 6 in 10 women have provided care for family members or friends in their lifetime, compared with 41% of men, whose contribution still is often financial, not in the provision of day-to-day care. Many caregivers leave their careers or reduce their hours, and as a result, lose out on various employee opportunities, which might lead to higher income. Important work assignments, promotions, raises, bonuses, and even skills enhancement through training provided at the workforce. One of the things that intrigues me the most, however, is that recent researchers are also beginning to look at a related economic security area, which also appears to disproportionately affect women. And there's not much been written about this. This data begins to show that women are more likely than men to spend their retirement savings and current income helping their kids or grandkids financially, with such as providing funds for education, home mortgage, first home mortgage costs, or seed money to start a business. This puts women, especially older women, more at risk of running out of money in their later years, since they're likely to have very few opportunities to replace these savings that they so generously have given away to their children and relatives. Running out of money in retirement is obviously a substantial worry for many older women and men as well, especially for women, since women are more likely to live longer than men and thus have several years of living on their own. And given the current economic climate of uncertainty around the globe, more and more adult children are continuing to rely financially on support for their parents. So this problem is likely to grow. And COVID, of course, has had an impact. As a result of the pandemic, the nature and structure of the workplace in the US and globally, I assume as well, has undergone dramatic changes. And it's unclear when, if ever, the traditional work patterns of the past will ever return. In the US, the extended lockdown during this time, many retail businesses were unable to survive. People stayed home, schools and daycare centers were closed, in-person learning was suspended. So overnight, parents working from home became educators responsible not only for their own childcare for their children, but also their learning experiences. Workers who could work from home, and virtual meetings became the norm. But recently, once the US public health restrictions on contact and travel began to ease, companies began to gradually reopen. But employers found that not all workers were eager to come back to in-person work. And the several months of lockdown seemed to provide an opportunity for many workers to rethink their goals and decide, as they say, to go in a different direction. In the US, everywhere you go, you see signs advertising job openings, even while our unemployment rate remains historically low. Some labor market experts assert that for the first time in decades, workers have some leverage in the employment marketplace. But for women, the choices are still pretty limited. Until recently, when most schools have reopened, kids were still at home, struggling to continue their education through virtual learning. Somebody had to be home to supervise them. So while dad may have had many choices, go back to work, or as many decided to become entrepreneurs and start their own businesses, mom was still often stuck at home. And if her employer was one of a growing number of employers who insisted that employees must show up in person, at least for some of the time, mom had a hard choice to make. So some women decided to become entrepreneurs themselves, reimagined their old jobs, created new work that could be completed at home rather than having to go to the office each day. And while I certainly applaud, and we all can applaud, this new attitude towards taking risk and entrepreneurial spirit, there still remain the vital caregiving functions that often fell to women. The simple reality is this: not all workers have come back, and many may not. The gig economy, which has been a small but growing part of the labor market in the US in the past, is flourishing because many people have decided they like the idea of flexible hours and being their own boss, even though that may not mean a steady or reliable paycheck or a pension in the future. But as we embrace these new flexibilities, it's clear that not all of them are necessarily available to women who are in the workforce, because many of the old challenges they faced, the wage gap, the retirement savings gap, the wealth gap, these challenges still remain. However, the nature and structure of work has changed in the US, So we will continue to work to mitigate these challenges, as well as identify and begin to address the inevitable new ones, because the economic security of women and their families demand it. Thank you.
Phyllis, really thanks for your speech, because as we have heard, the challenges are many, especially after COVID. It's really interesting, Phyllis, to have listened to the observation point, the United States, and what challenges await us and what gaps still need to be filled. There is still too long way to go. And we believe women are essential for the stability of social welfare, and we will do everything to continue as a Family Economy Week to raise awareness in our community, to push for structural reforms for a more equitable distribution of income and a just pension. Also in Italy, we have problem in that sense. So really, thank you, Philip Borzi, for your valuable testimony and for being with us here at the Family Economy Week 2023. And now I would like to ask to Felicia Henderson about diversity inclusion. Where are we in Europe today? And in the world of work, but also in society, what are the nodes to be solved in terms of cultural and ethnic differences?
Thank you so much for the question. So where are we in Europe? I'm going to give you some general trends using some OECD statistics from a report that they produced called All Hands In, Making Diversity Work for All. And the trends that I'm going to talk about are general trends, but it is important to understand that there is significant variability between European countries. So in thinking about local context, it's going to be very important to identify the specific gaps within a particular country. Having said that, let me run through a couple of the dimensions of diversity that the OECD dug into in thinking about where Europe is in diversity. So with respect to gender, very much as Phyllis was explaining, there is a gap. There remains an employment gap between men and women. And there was a very positive trend in that gap prior to the pandemic. So in the decade prior to the pandemic, that gap was closing. Unfortunately, for many of the reasons that Phyllis explained quite brilliantly, women lost out during the pandemic. Female workers lost out the most during the pandemic. So the employment gap between men and women is increasing. With respect to age, another dimension of diversity that is important, that does shape people's life opportunities and future retirement. There is an employment gap between what are so-called prime age workers, people from 25 to 54, and older workers, people who are 55 and through retirement age, and we know that retirement ages are creeping up in Europe. So there is a gap between older workers and prime age workers, and that gap was also declining over the decade prior to the pandemic. Unfortunately, older workers, being more vulnerable, more susceptible to more severe forms of COVID, were also significantly affected by the pandemic. So that gap is also, the employment gap between prime age and older workers is also increasing. With respect to another dimension of diversity that you touched on, and that I'm going to go into a little bit more detail in, looking at foreign-born populations versus native-born populations, the picture is a little bit more mixed. In some countries, a few countries, there is an equivalent or even slightly higher employment rate for native-born workers, while in others there is a significant gap with foreign-born populations, migrant populations. being significantly underemployed as compared to native-born populations. And digging deeper into that statistic, in many countries, foreign-born women actually have higher rates of employment than native-born women. But we have to ask ourselves what's going on with these figures. For example, is there a significant immigrant population arriving with job offers in hand? So highly skilled workers who have been recruited to fill gaps in employment or to fill gaps in skills within the country, or is much of the migration from people seeking economic opportunities? And we also have to think about what jobs are available to the migrant population. If we think, for example, about foreign-born women having apparently higher rates of employment, then we also have to ask, are they employed in the low-wage service jobs that Phyllis was speaking about, housekeepers, personal service workers, that exacerbate income and wealth inequality? And I would be remiss in a conversation about diversity and inclusion to ignore disability. The employment gap is largest for this dimension, with people having one or more disabilities being significantly underemployed as compared to the general population. I want to come to your specific question about cultural and ethnic differences, and here referring to an EU publication, being Black in Europe, that was published annually prior to the pandemic, and that we hope they will begin to print again. We understand that with respect to people of African descent in Europe, 30% experienced some form of race-based harassment, 39% felt discriminated against on the basis of race, and 1 in 4 of the survey respondents reported experiencing discrimination in the workplace. I could talk about other dimensions of diversity, for example, religion, rising Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. And then there are dimensions that are sometimes ignored, regional differences, opportunities in urban areas that are not present in rural areas. The general challenge with respect to diversity, equity, and inclusion in Europe is that, unfortunately, it is often presented as a zero-sum game with winners and losers. And again, we have information about attitudes in Europe. For example, a Eurobarometer survey suggested that on the one hand, people in Europe, a small minority of those surveyed, believed that enough was being done to promote diversity in their workplace. Only about 21% of survey respondents believed that was true. But on the other hand, only a minority of people supported concrete diversity measures in their workplace. 35% supported monitoring recruitment to ensure equity or absence of bias. 36% supported diversity training for employees and employers. So in thinking about the seeming contradiction, we aren't doing enough, but we actually don't want our employer to do more. The OECD authors suggested that there are fears that concrete diversity measures may affect the individuals negatively. There are additional challenges if we talk about ethnicity. There are 2 primary myths. One is that Europe is homogenous. We tend to believe in a colorblind Europe, so don't actually see or count these dimensions of diversity. And a second myth is that Europe is tolerant. And unfortunately, we do have increasing information that discrimination in many areas of society, including employment, and violence, from harassment to actual physical violence, is increasingly prevalent in Europe as the population becomes more heterogeneous and contact between groups increases.
So Felicia, gaps also in Europe, but a very positive trend before the pandemic. So we have to hope for the future, and we really hope that the world will be able to initiate a sustainable recovery despite the slowdown in the global economy that probably we'll be expecting also due to the ongoing war. I would like to ask you now to Eleftherios Nicolaou, what are the main evidences that emerged from your study regarding the different level of financial knowledge and approach to economic issues between men and women?
Firstly, I would like to draw your attention to the only global survey of financial literacy to date, the Standard & Poor's Ratings Services Global Financial Literacy Survey that was conducted in 2014. Based on the survey, only 33% of adults worldwide are financially literate. The average financial literacy rates across the European Union was 52%, and the variance between individual countries was great. Let's look at Southern Europe. The respective rate in Spain was 49%, in Malta 44%, in Italy 37%, and in Cyprus 35%. Greece showcased a financial literacy rate of 45%, meaning that more than 1 out of 2 adults are financially literate, which is nowhere near an acceptable level. Responding to the need for additional, more recent and reliable data with regards to different sections of the population in Greece, especially the youth, the chairman and members of the Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute have conducted multiple scientific studies. The first of those is entitled Financial Literacy and Financial Well-Being Among Generation Z University Students, Evidence from Greece. The research was conducted in 2016, and the full scientific paper was later published in 2019 in the European Journal of Finance. The authors, Nikolaos Philippas, professor of finance at the University of Piraeus and chairman and founder of the Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute, as well as Dr. Christos Avdoulas, postdoctoral researcher at the Athens University of Economics and Business, measured the levels of financial literacy, financial fragility, and financial well-being in order to evaluate their influence among university students in Greece. They also investigated the roles of demographic, socioeconomic, and financial behavior characteristics which could be attributed to changes in the aforementioned sectors. According to their methodology, the levels of financial literacy in Greek university students, in absolute terms, that is, the percentage of students that answered correctly in all 5 financial knowledge questions, were 19.3%. For comparison reasons, when the authors applied the measurement level of financial literacy where participants had to answer at least 4 questions correctly, the financial literacy rate was 50%. Thus, the levels of financial literacy support the conjecture that university students in Greece have greater financial knowledge than the general population, 50% versus 45%. With regards to gender, a higher percentage of male students had at least 4 correct responses as compared to female students, 29% versus 21% of the total sample. Moreover, the number of males is higher in the sample of financial literate students than in the sample of financially illiterate students, which is not true about female students. This result indicates that male students may be more financially knowledgeable. Additionally, the results show that students whose father has an upper high school diploma, bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree have a 3.5 times, 3.1 times, or 2.2 times, respectively, higher possibility of being financially literate than those whose father has no education. Male students are 2 times more likely to show acceptable levels of financial literacy than female students. Also, students who keep a record of expenses have a higher possibility of being financially literate than those who do not. With regards to financial fragility, when asked whether they could cover an unexpected shock of 300 euros if it arose in the coming month, 42% of the students claimed that they were sure that they could cover the amount, while 40% claimed that they could maybe cover the amount. Almost 18% of the participants were not that sure if they could cover it, or they definitely could not cover it. From another viewpoint, 52.9% of the students with an excellent level of financial literacy were certain that they could cover an unexpected economic shock. By contrast, only 35% of the students with lower financial literacy answered that they could cover the unexpected amount. Recognizing this difference, we could assume that students with financial knowledge have learned to manage their finances for unexpected events. With regards to financial well-being, the analysis showed that over a half of the student sample could cover everyday expenses or could cover them most of the time, while only 26% answered that they could not cover these expenses. Furthermore, a vast majority of the students, 71% that is, do not save or rarely save for their future. These are the most interesting and alarming signs that showcase how the recent global and local financial crises have influenced the financial behavior of Greek university students. Thank you.
Thank you. Eleftherios, these are data really interesting that further highlight the role of school education in identifying more and more time for financial education. And we talked about school, and the school prepares us for the world of work, the workers of the future. And Felicia, I would like to ask you, how can labor policies contribute to change and to allow greater social and economic participation of those segments of the population that are discriminated against?
Thank you for the question and the transition, actually, from the prior intervention. One of the major challenges to integrating populations that are currently discriminated against, that are currently disadvantaged, is actually a lack of knowledge. So one of the things that one of my co-authors and I have found is that when people lack knowledge of history, in particular, one of the studies that we focused on was set in the U.S. context, but is generalizable given the cognitive mechanisms at work. We found that people who lack knowledge of Black history, in particular in the U.S., white Americans who lack knowledge of Black history are simply unable to recognize racism. They're unable to recognize systems of oppression. So one role that stepping outside of labor policy specifically and looking at government policy generally is for education policy to really have a broad-based view of history, helping understand where systems of marginalization and oppression have been created. And this is not just with respect to race, with respect to other systems of oppression that have been created. For example, creating socioeconomic hierarchies in the history of Europe. A second specific government intervention is to move from the policy that currently in many countries prohibits or strongly discourages collection of disaggregated data that allows for identifying, for example, ethnicity, race data. There are a number of countries, in fact, I think all countries in Europe allow collection of information on ethnicity proxies, such as country of birth. But these proxies do not give us a clear indication of the populations in the country, and also do not give us clear information about the discrimination that they may be experiencing. So having governments move towards collection of ethnic identity and statistics is something that the European Union has championed recently, has clarified that GDPR does not prohibit this type of collection as long as it's done in a way that protects the people who are meant to be protected, those who may be subject to discrimination. So, for example, voluntary disclosure, anonymized information, etc. And the EU has strongly encouraged member states to actively collect this data. Businesses have already, many businesses, including many of the multinationals that I work with, have already moved to begin collecting this data. They have sought legal advice, have made sure that they are not contravening any data collection policies, and have begun to collect data so that they can actually measure their populations for disparities. I think I have maybe 1 more minute, so I will talk about a specific intervention that companies need to undertake. And that is to have a true diversity, equity, and inclusion engagement. And that requires a multidimensional and intersectional approach. I think in her opening remarks, Phyllis reminded us that when we talk about women, we are talking about several populations of women. So she provided the pay gaps for African-American women, Latina women. Understanding that there are gaps within populations is extraordinarily important. And we know that European institutions, European organizations are moving towards EDI initiatives. I think 90% of organizations in a recent survey had at least one initiative underway. And that certainly sounds positive, but the same survey also suggested that 2/3 of the organizations did not have an EDI strategy, and almost half of them had no dedicated structure. So sitting down and figuring out the why, what are we doing, instead of tackling problems as they arise, is extraordinarily important so that we can begin to affect real change in organizations and in societies. And I will stop there.
Thanks, Felicia. The point on the company and the multidimensional approach is really, really interesting. We act as spokespersons for all the stakeholders who are listening to us to raise their awarenesses about those topics. Really, really important and interesting. And I would like now to ask the last question for Eleftherios. What programs and initiatives can contribute to leveling the difference you mentioned earlier? And how important it is to involve the children in the financial awareness game?
At the Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute, we are adamant supporters that financial education should start early on in the lives of citizens, that is, from primary school. Financial education in schools should be part of a coordinated, holistic national strategy, and the educational system should be involved in the development of this strategy. As young pupils can understand the importance of saving money from the early age of 4, financial education should start as early as possible, ideally from the beginning of formal schooling and carry on until the end of the student's time in school. Financial education should ideally be a core part of the school curriculum. Unfortunately, the Greek public education system is based on a strict institutional framework, so financial education can be taught as only as an elective subject in the curriculum or integrated into other subjects like mathematics, economics, social science, citizenship studies, or history. Some relevant policy recommendations may include the following. Emphasis should be placed on the needs of low-achieving students. Learning results that stem from social and economic inequalities should be addressed early on. Equal learning opportunities should be given to both boys and girls. Students should be encouraged to make most of the opportunities provided within the school framework. emphasis and attention should be given not only to young people, but also to their parents. The school framework should provide the students with relevant experiences outside the school environment, provided that their safety has been ensured first. Correct assessment of the impact of initiatives taking place inside and outside the school context should be ensured. We must understand that the role of the school is of utmost importance in order to meet the needs of young people regarding the acquisition of the appropriate, financial skills. The school has the unique opportunity to approach both parents and teachers in order for them to spread and adopt prudent financial habits as future members of our society. The school offers the right framework for the development of quality teaching and effective learning. The existing curriculum, pedagogical tools, as well as the various school supplies can be used to meet the needs of young people in terms of financial education, given that students are the most suitable audience for the dissemination of financial knowledge, as they have both the time and the ability to learn. In order to have equal opportunities among young people, it is important that financial education is offered to people who would not otherwise have access to it. Schools are the appropriate channel to promote financial literacy among all demographic groups, including vulnerable groups such as low-income families and immigrant families, so that the cycle of financial illiteracy can be gradually broken and the intense intergenerational social inequalities may be stopped. In this approach, we are extremely glad that the preparatory work for the development of a national strategy for financial literacy in Greece has already started. The project is supervised by the Ministry of Finance, coordinated by the Special Secretariat for Private Debt Management, and implemented by the OECD, with the Hellenic Finance received a recognized advisory position and having already contributed greatly to its formation.
Okay, thanks for your answer, Eleftherios. And now I would like to do a last question to Phyllis Board. Phyllis, we are going through a critical period for the balance of the whole world. You know, another epochal challenge after COVID. What do you think should be the priority of governments to mitigate the issue of all the social gaps we have talked about today?
Thank you so much for the question. I think the answer, my answer would be to agree with Felicia. Felicia talked about how important it is for education and understanding. And I think that's the first thing. We need to begin to understand where the gaps are and how to address them. And education is the first clue, but research, data gathering is critically important. And I will say one other thing that I've learned from my long career in this area, and that is each country, and I'll say this for the US in particular because I'm an American, each country needs to look beyond its own borders because we have much to learn and some to teach with respect to our global partners. The problems and the gaps that we see in the social safety net and with respect to equity and diversity are not unique to any one country. They are global. Each country is going to fashion its own response. But to me, the most important thing is for us to begin to understand not only what causes the gaps and what steps we might be able to take within our own countries, but to look more broadly at the global economy and see how other countries have dealt with problems so that we can learn from their mistakes and their successors. In the United States, if you were to ask me what my policy priorities are to try to reduce the gaps that we see, particularly for women and ethnic minorities, a couple of legislative initiatives, I think raising the minimum wage. Most minimum wage workers don't earn enough to even meet they're below poverty with a full-time worker in the house. So raising the minimum wage will be a baby step towards addressing the problem. And in the United States, we really do need paid family and medical leave. And finally, I would say we need to create a system in the US where there is credit towards your retirement, both under private pension systems and the Social Security system, for years spent in caregiving, so that we don't disadvantage primarily women who wind up having, as I said, to drop out of the workforce completely or for temporary time or reduce their hours to take care of caregiving activities, because that's what creates the economic security and causes the economic security of families to be able to function. So those are my suggestions.
Thanks for your really precious suggestions, and thank you very much for the valuable content of all of you. And we wish really everyone a good continuation of the Family Economy Week. Thanks to Philip Borzi, former Obama administration's Assistant Secretary for Employee Benefit Security of the United States Department of Labor. Thanks to Felicia Anderson, Adjunct Lecturer at Sciences for Paris, and thanks to Eleftherios Nicolaou, Managing Director of Hellenic Financial Literacy Institute. Thanks to all of you, and greetings to all. And at this point, I leave a very short takeout video about our episode of today. Thank you, and have a good continuation of Family Economy Week.